Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the south in the direction of Robotyne, where the Russians have advanced slightly northwest of the village. This confirms their control over the fortified position northwest of Robotyne, and with this advance, the Russians are now moving along the highway between Robotyne and Novodanilivka, similarly to their advances from the east. It's likely that the Russians will continue pushing both from the north of Robotyne and from the east of Novodanilivka towards the town by the intersection. In the next section of the front line, along the Vodiane area and Vuhledar area, the Russians have advanced both in the direction of Krasnohorivka and Vodiane, where in the direction of Vodiane, the Russians have advanced along the main road towards the fortified position of the Ukrainian armed forces in the area. We have seen that the Russians have advanced along the eastern side of the road for this past month, and this advance continues along the main road as the Russians continue pushing the Ukrainians backwards. They've been advancing and capturing a few forest lines here and there, and now their positions are very close to the road in between the direction of Krasnohorivka to Vuhledar. Direction of Krasnohorivka, positional fighting continues outside the town as Russians expand the zone of control from the outside to widen the front along the outside of the town. This will allow the Russians to expand the zone of control and advance from multiple directions, similar to the Battle of Vuhledar, where at the start the Russians were attacking from the eastern parts. After that failed, they kept expanding their positions to include the entirety of the south. As they continued pushing in the eastern direction, they also expanded in the northern direction to gain control over the northern parts of the town. So you'll likely see similar tactics in this direction of Krasnohorivka, where Russians will look to expand zone of control and attack from three separate directions, from the northeast, from the east, and from the southeast, all at the same time. Further north here, in the direction of Krasnohorivka, the Russians have managed to capture everything except for the final streets here in the northwestern outskirts of the city. According to the geolocated footage, we see the Russians raising the flag in the northwestern parts of the city. This indicates that it is pretty much considered taken by the Russians. There is nothing left here in the northern parts. However, at the same time, the Ukrainians have yet again counterattacked to recapture some positions here in the south, considering that it is the fourth time it changes hands within just a few weeks. I'm leaving it as a gray zone until one side completely and securely takes control of the area. Other than that, I'll have to just leave it in the gray zone as to not continuously change the map every other day. In the Avdiivka section of the front line, the Russians have advanced pretty much everywhere I expected them to. As I've said previously in my analysis, the Russians are going to be attacking both in the direction of Shelani, Serhivka, Vesele, Ivanivka, Lysishne, Timofivka, and Vostyshenka all at the same time. We're currently seeing that they're also pushing down south west of Novoslivka Persia to align the front line along the river line of the Vovcha River and along Umansky Yastrudivka, advancing in a western direction along the coast. All of this to push the Ukrainians back across the river line following the capture of Novoslivka Persia. At the same time, we see that in the northwestern direction, the Russians are also expanding along the railways, where they are pushing towards the Ukrainian fortified positions. This has two advantages to continue advancing along the railway. The first one is that most of the fortified position actually point in an eastern direction, as with these ones and further south as well, along the Serhivka direction. Most of these positions have fortified positions that are facing in an eastern direction. Therefore, if they advance continuously along the railway, they'll be able to flank some of these fortified positions and hit them from the rear. This will allow them to gain an advantage when fighting against them. At the same time, they are advancing along the railways, which has the cover of the forest area on both sides. It has the high ground advantage. Both of these allows the Russians to move along the forest lines on the outside of the railways. That allows them to continuously be under cover of the forest areas and then move into the towns and against the fortified positions along these railways with their infantry, and then they can be supported by armored vehicles from Pokrovsk and Vuhledar, which will be able to push both to the northeast of Shelane and to the northwest of Pokrovsk itself towards Ivanivka. It seems that the Russians have established positions on the outsides of most of these villages, but in the direction of Vuhledar, they've actually managed to gain a foothold and captured the eastern outskirts of the village. So we see that some of these villages are actually being stormed, while others are being fought over positionally from the outside. We see that across the Avdiivka section of the front line, the Russians have continuously advanced over the past month, and currently extremely heavy fighting is taking place here in the west of the Vuhledar river line. The Russians have sent many companies of infantry across the river line to push here in this northern flank to gain advantage of the current position. It is reminiscent of the battles that took place ahead of the capture of Vuhledar, in the sense that a large number of Russian soldiers are now pushing, and they are pushing in every single direction to gain control over the area, which will secure their foothold across the river line, and not just that, but allow the Russians to significantly expand their zone of control in the area. Similarly to myself, Syriac Maps also believes that the current operations by the Russians will be looking to gain control over Ust-Ishenka in the northwest before going for the intersection between Pokrovsk and Krasnohorivka here by the highway, that the Russians will continue to move in a western and southern direction with the main focus to the south and establishing a complete and stable front line from the highway and all the way down south to Novgorodivka and Hrodivka, which both are towns that are main defensive positions of the Ukrainians east of Pokrovsk, after which they will launch an operation to capture both of these towns, and then they'll be moving on to the final line of defense of the Ukrainians ahead of Pokrovsk, which would be Mirnorad and other towns along the outskirts of Pokrovsk. This means we are currently in the first and second stage of the Russian offensive operations in this section of the front line, and the main focus of the Russians right now is to expand as much as possible, which will allow the Russians to gain control over the area, expand their zone of control to establish positions for further offensive operations towards Novgorodivka and Hrodivka, 2 points towards Pokrovsk with focused and concentrated assaults, mainly across the railway, but also across the road from Pokrovsk to Hrodivka. In the next section of the front line along the north of the Bakhmut area, near Selesyansk, the Russians have advanced in 2 directions. The first one is here to the northwest of the village along the main highway. They are pushing at the forest areas in the area to flank the Ukrainian positions by Vuhledar and the grouping of villages here along the highway towards the Ukrainian fortified positions here to the north. At the same time, they're attacking north of Selesyansk towards the Ukrainian fortified positions in the area. It is likely that the Russians, rather than focusing on the village agglomeration here along the highway, that they're going to be attacking in the direction of the village chain to the north, like Vasyukivka, Vuhledar, and other villages here in the north. This is to expand the zone of control and essentially flank the positions by going around towards the canal line and expanding the zone of control, and similarly to the Chasiv direction, gain control over a northern and southern flank, which will allow the Russians to isolate the positions of the Ukrainians across the canal line from each other to expand the zone of control bit by bit, or it could also just be an attempt to expand the zone of control here in the direction of Siversk and flank it from the rear. So we see that opening the front here to the west will expand the front line, but will also enable the Russians to have a wider variety of offensive operations and tactics that they can make use of to improve their positions in the Siversk section of the front line. Further north here in the direction of the Kupyansk section of the front line, the Russians have expanded the zone of control north of Peshane, where they've captured the rest of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians and the forest area southwest of Tabaivka, With this, we see the Russians continuously expand their zone of control by Pishane. Following the capture of the town, they've expanded the zone of control in the area, and they now control approximately 15 square kilometers additional territory compared to prior to the assaults towards Pishane. And we still see the Ukrainians have fortified positions south of Pishane, which the Russians are likely going to be attacking next to gain control of. And this will allow the Russians to have a strong flank south and north of Pishane to continue pushing in a western direction towards the Oskar River line. It could also allow the Russians to expand the front line along the forest areas in the open fields to expand the zone of control and then push towards the second Pishane along the railways or towards the villages on a wider front along the east of the Oskar River line. So we see that the capture of Pishane has significantly improved the Russian positions in the area. Compared to the capture of Vuhledar and Kislivka, it has also significantly improved their positions in the area, and all of this together allows the Russians to have a more confident position in the area to expand and launch offensive operations rather than being constantly on the switch between offensive and defensive positions. As Ukrainians could constantly launch counterattacks, it is now more difficult for the Ukrainians as they have to cross a wider area at which the Russians can both send drones to detect them and launch artillery strikes, FPV strikes, and whatever else is needed to hold back a Ukrainian counterattack. This means that the Ukrainians would have to dedicate more troops and more equipment for such counterattacks, which they do not currently have a lot of. Based on all this, we see that there are significant advances by the Russians across the entirety of the front line, and that offensive operations continue in areas that we expected that wouldn't continue as much as it has, and in some areas it is going exactly as predicted. Therefore, we see that the Russians simply have a lot of equipment and a lot of manpower available. Some claim that, well, right now the Ukrainians are saving equipment, they're saving manpower, and the Russians are losing it. Therefore, at some point the Russian offensive will run out of steam, and the Ukrainians will launch a new counterattack to return some of the positions lost to turn the tide. However, as I have previously mentioned, the current Russian offensive is not one that is massive, it is instead one that is sustainable. This means that the Russians can continue launching at this scale, and it will instead increase in scale as time goes by, because the Russians are actually gaining more equipment, they're gaining more soldiers than they are losing at the front line. On the contrary, the Ukrainians are losing more than they are gaining. That is due to two factors. The first one is the limited supply of weapons from the West. It is not enough to make up for the losses of the Ukrainians, much less to make them grow. And at the same time, the mobilization is very extensive, but they do not get the necessary training, which will allow them to survive longer at the front line, which will allow the Ukrainian army to grow. So the Ukrainian army in manpower is not growing, and the Ukrainian army in equipment is not growing. Both are declining at a faster rate than they are recruiting and building and acquiring. Therefore, the Russians are expanding their military, the Ukrainian military is reducing, falling shorter every day, and that is why we see that the Russians are simply continuing to push the Ukrainian lines, and the Ukrainians are unable to stop the Russian advance, which has continued for many days on end. Every single day of this month, the Russians have advanced here in the Pokrovsk area of the front line in the direction of Pokrovsk. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.